Okay, lovely. Welcome everyone to the next in our series of webinars. My name is Julia Lambeth. I'm an educator at WSET School London, but it is very much not me you're here to see this evening. We have been doing a series of webinars during lockdown, separate to the online qualifications that we're doing. And we're very lucky tonight to be doing a session on Irish whiskey with Charlie McCarthy. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to pass you over to him and he's going to take us through.
Thank you very much, Julia. As Julia mentioned, my name is Charlie McCarthy. I'm lucky enough to work full-time for WSET in their Bermondsey office in London, where I help with rolling out the spirits education program across Europe, Middle East, Africa, and India. At the moment, I am currently in West Cork in Ireland, in my hometown of Skibbereen, because as we are all socially distancing and working from home currently, it seems that being in lovely West Cork was quite an attractive option for a month or two. Okay, so what we're talking about today is the 6 ages of Irish whiskey, and I've broken them down very roughly into the first age, which is Ishkabaha, the father or possibly the mother of whiskey. Then we have the division of Poitín versus Parliament whiskey, followed by the golden age of pot still Irish whiskey, and then the encroaching threat from silent spirit and other catastrophes, which in turn gave birth to the classic 20th century Irish blends that we all know so well. And now we're in a very much a booming renaissance period for Irish whiskey, with a whole host of new distilleries opening and new styles developing. And we're going to address that at the end in what we're going to call the new wave of 21st century iconoclasts. Okay, glitch number 1. It does work. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so introduction, Diarrhyd, which is Gaelic Irish for hello. The focus for today's webinar is obviously an Irish whiskey. I'm going to try to bring it back to the flavor profile as much as possible. So we will be talking about history quite a lot today, but I don't want it to feel, despite the glut of dates and mentions of various excise laws and distillation laws, I'm going to try to make it relevant to type of liquid that existed at the time and the equivalent in the modern day, which will be, for the most part, available on the market. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge a lot of people who books that I read in the lead up to this over the preceding number of years. Principal among them would be Irish Whiskey by Peter Mulryan. Also, A Glass Apart, The History of Pot Still Irish Whiskey by Fionnán O'Connor. And Matt Healy, who runs a great series of podcasts on Irish whiskey called potstill.com. There are plenty of others. There is, well, we'll get onto those later. But for the most part, those are my origins and sources of most of my information. And hopefully I'm not doing them a service by getting anything too wildly wrong today. So, distillation. You get your grain. You mash your grain up, you put it in some water, and yeast gets introduced. The yeast ferments, creates alcoholic fermentation, which you will end up with something akin to 10% beer. You put that into your still, be that a pot still or a column still. By the addition of heat, you are going to select and concentrate certain elements, and these choices will be determined by your local laws. And then you're going to put that spirit, if you want to make whiskey, you're going to put that into barrels or casks. These will almost always be oak, but as we're going to see later, there are some exceptions. And in Ireland, they will have to rest in oak casks for 3 years before they can be called whiskey, and then they are finished and bottled. So that's essentially the process of how whiskey is made and what whiskey is. I'm sure we're already there, most of us, but for purposes of today's talk, it's going to be interesting for us to see the changes that happen through the various different points in history. Now, we also have here what we call the WSET Level 2 Systematic Approach to Tasting Spirits. And every WSET course will have a systematic approach to tasting attached to it. And when we judge a spirit or in the WSET method, we're looking at the appearance, the nose, the palate, and as part of the palate also the finish, and importantly as part of the palate the texture, which a lot of people neglect. And then we can draw conclusions as to the quality. Then we have on the right hand side of that page, we have some descriptors of the aromas and flavors, and some aromas and notes that might be associated with the process, such as smoke, esters, which are the fruit notes of apple, bananas, and pears, which are usually created during the fermentation process, and signs of oak maturation. Typically, that's going to be vanilla, toast, and some red fruits if you're using European oak or ex-sherry casks. Not going to spend too long on this because we've got a lot to get through. So, Star Wars beginning a long time ago in a country far, far away. Where did whiskey begin? Well, we know that spirits and distillation did not begin in either Ireland or Scotland. In fact, distillation can be traced back to the Arab Renaissance. There are records in ancient Greece from about 100 years AD of salt water being distilled into fresh water. But continuing on the Star Wars theme, some of you are going to recognize this rock on the left-hand side. If you looked at the recent Star Wars movies, this is where Luke Skywalker was living like a hermit. And that is quite appropriate because it was actually a retreat for Irish Hermetic monks from around the 6th century to the 13th century. And it's called Skellig Michael. And this is essentially as far west as you can go in Europe. Now, why this is pertinent to the story of whiskey is that most Irish monks, and many of them, if they had the opportunity, would go on a pilgrimage either to Rome or to the Middle East, where you had the Holy Lands. And many of them over this time period, about 1,000 years ago, roughly, although we can't be sure exactly, would have brought back the craft and art of distillation from Greece, from the Moorish travelers that they would have met along the way, and from the traditions that already existed in the Middle East. Now, we know that within the monastic tradition, you still have spirits and liqueurs today that date from this time. A really good example of this would be chartreuse, which is created by the Cartesian monks, French Alps. But in Ireland, when they brought this knowledge of how to take what was essentially wine and heat it and turn it by selection into a stronger spirit, which is called in Latin aquavitae, they discovered that they didn't really have great access to fruit in Ireland at the time. So what a lot of the monks started doing is they started fermenting grains into beer rather than fruits into wine, and converting that into a spirit. And this spirit, rather than being called aquavitae, which is the Latin for water of life, then in the local Gaelic, which was the Irish language, which was then and still is spoken on the island here, it's called Ishkabaha. Ishkabaha, aquavitae both mean water of life. And so from around the 12th century through the 13th and 14th century, we have various written records of references to Ishkabaha or Ishkaba in Ireland. When Henry II launched his invasion of the area around Dublin and Leinster, there are records of the soldiers being given Ishkaba to prepare them for battle. Similarly, there is a purported record from Sir Robert Savage of Bushmills, said to have given these men a mighty draught of Ishkabaha before battle. Now, you will have noticed my first mention up here of Etymology Corner. Etymology Corner there's a lot of word origins associated with whiskey. So this phrase here, the pale, I'm sure some of you will have heard of the expression "that's beyond the pale," and that would mean that's not on, that's uncivilized behavior. The pale was actually a physical location, and most of the Anglo-Norman invasions in Ireland and their subsequent conclaves were centered around what's now Dublin. And there was a walled area around Dublin, and inside that wall was known as the Pale, and that was seen by the Anglo-Normans as a civilized part of Ireland, and beyond the Pale was the uncivilized part of Ireland. And this will be pertinent later because there's a big division in the history of Irish whiskey between what happened in Dublin and what happened in the rest of the country. A notable early record is 1324, the Red Book of Ossory, written by the Bishop of Kilkenny, Richard Ledred. And in that, he describes in some detail the process of distillation. Now, we think that he might have actually been describing an eau de vie, a fruit eau de vie, rather than a whiskey, but it's certain that at this stage, Ishkabaha was well established within Ireland, both within the monasteries, and also the knowledge had seeped out into the common folk and common use. So by the time King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in the 1530s, Ireland had, to all intents and purposes, really become part of the English crown and the English realm at this stage through various conquests. And at this stage, Ishkabaha was the common drink of the people. Anybody who had any excess crop, rather than if they keep some seed for the following year, and if they had any left over that from harvest, they would ferment it and they would then distill it. There wasn't any great tradition of beer drinking in Ireland at this time. People mostly drank milk and Ishkabaha. And so we come to 1556, Parliament's first attempt at the regulation of whiskey. Essentially, they tried to grant monopolies that whiskey could only be made by the lords and the ladies of the gentry. And this is where we begin to see the first, the origins of the dichotomy between Ishkabaha and whiskey. What Ishkabaha would have been very much like something I have in this bottle here. You can tell it's a bit dusty. This bottle, I can't really say where I got it from, but this is illegally distilled poaching. Poaching was illegal to distill in Ireland from around the 1600s right up to about 20 years ago. But most households had access to poaching. It was a common ingredient used in the making of Christmas cakes, for instance. So poaching is Gaelic for little pot. And if we look at a pot still, the modern pot still, the principle is exactly the same. You take your fermented liquid, in this case of beer, you put it in to your still, you apply heat, and through the application of heat, vapors arise. The most volatile vapors will rise up first, and through this process, you can make cuts over time when it comes off the line arm in a liquid form, having been condensed. The first part is the heads, second part of the hearts is the hearts, and the last part is the tail. And you can select that. And usually, when we're talking about pot distillation at this stage, we're talking about a double distillation process, i.e., you fill the pot with beer, run it through, got your first distillate off that, then reintroduce that distillate to the pot, run it through again, and got a stronger distillate off that. Now, it's important to note that Ishkabaha at this stage was very much a domestic, the cottage industry spirit. It was almost always unaged. It was generally drunk, flavored with fennel, anise, tarragon, sometimes raisins, often mint, often thyme, and it was oftentimes consumed by the locals with milk. A lot of the time it would have been consumed apparently with goat's milk. Now I'm going to pour a bit of this into the bottle. This is not Powers whiskey. Let me just be very clear about this. This is poaching, what would later become known as moonshine. Now, most poaching... Hello? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard somebody jumping in there. Most poaching in Ireland would have a regional variance. Every region would have their own style. Some regions evolved a style that would have been slightly herbal. Some regions would have a double distillate. Some regions would have a triple distillate. Some regions would have used peat, which was the common local fuel at the time, to dry and malt some of their barley. So there would have been some peated poaching around at the time. There was as many varieties of poaching as there were towns in Ireland. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but using the systematic approach to tasting spirits, we can tell that it's clear, water white. In terms of intensity, it's clean. I would say it's a medium intensity. On the nose, I'm getting a little bit of malt, some caramel, and some toffee. No processing of oak, no maturation involved in this. It would have come off the still after its second or third distillation and be bottled. Now, I fully expect this to be very, very, very pokey. Doesn't say an ABV on the bottle, but poaching would traditionally be up around 60%, sometimes higher. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to this straight away before even trying to taste it. Yeah, very grassy. A lot of kind of straw and hay. and a small apple note, actually, which is going to be a note that we're going to come back to a lot in Irish whiskey. Yeah, it's got quite farmyardy character. There's a lot of kind of hay and kind of slightly mulchy character. This, in fairness, is not a million miles away from a lot of new make spirits that will be produced in whiskey distilleries in modern times. I cannot speak whatsoever to the distillation process that was involved in this, because I was probably distilled up in the hills somewhere in the middle of the night in a very primitive still setup. But that essentially is what would have been considered Irish Ishkabah or Ishkabaha for quite a long time, for a couple of centuries. When Dr. Johnson wrote his first dictionary, he extolled Irish Ishkabaha. It might have been slightly different from this liquid, as we get onto later. It's also very popular in the court of Peter the Great and the court of Elizabeth I. So how do we go from this, something resembling this? Well, a lot of the history of Irish whiskey comes down to the Crown and the government of England, or the United Kingdom as it would later become, trying to impose regulations in order to extract duty and profit from the production of spirits. So James I granted the first patents to distill. I think it was in 1603, and the third patent granted was Sir Thomas Phillips, who was distilling in Bushmills, which is a town in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. That was in April 1608. Now, Bushmills to this day, unfortunately, don't have a bottle of Bushmills with me. Bushmills Black is, for my money, one of the best value for money whiskies available anywhere in the world. But they still have that date, 1608. It's not a continuous location of distillation, but it is the patent that was granted to them. But the monopoly system that came from the system of patent was rife. It was rife for cronyism, rife for corruption. Ireland at this stage wasn't really subjugated to the British Crown, and it was still quite a hostile territory. So it was very expensive for this invasionary force to support the armies and battalions that they had garrisoned the island of Ireland. And they tried to raise more taxes against whiskey. They abolished monopolies, but by 1661, the very first excise duty was enshrined into law anywhere in the world, and it had the effect of deepening the dichotomy between poteen and Parliament whiskey. And I think that previous slide gave you a hint of what that dichotomy was. Parliament whiskey is, well, the word whiskey is a derivation of the word Ishkabaha, or the Scots word Ishkabah, and you can see how that would have been corrupted into the English word whiskey. In 1661, this tax in Ireland was very much not observed by anybody outside of the Pale, largely. At this stage, Ireland was largely occupied, certainly more in the eastern province of Leinster. Local distilling was still very much the norm, and even up to 1779, there were 1,228 registered legal distilleries in Ireland, and there was almost certainly an order of magnitude more distilleries than that were operating just on a cottage basis. Distilling, much like brewing, was largely woman's work. It was largely the lady of the house who would be in charge of running the pot. And the word poteen derives from the Irish word for pot, which is pot, and een, which means small. So poteen means small pot, and you would distill your home distilled spirit in your little poteen, your little small pot. And various regulations came in, largely taxing the size of the stills, so that by the end of the 18th century, there were only 246 registered distilleries in Ireland. Now, I know we're jumping way forward here. You're going to see why in a second. What this meant is that only large distilleries could survive because of the way that the excise and the various taxes were imposed. You had to have a very large still. One of the largest stills the world has ever seen is over 130,000 gallons, and we're going to see a picture of that later. That was the still in the Middleton Distillery, which came a little bit later than this. But distillers in the large distilleries had to charge their stills continuously in order to meet their tax bills. They run their stills very hot. So the spirit that came out was actually quite rough. And when you run your still very hot, especially in a pot still, the beer is going to froth up and bubble. That's going to choke the worms in the worm tub, so you're going to have to start everything again. But a way of stopping bubbles is, ironically, by introducing a bit of soap. So what they used to do is they would introduce soap into the pot to kill this froth. So you had very poor quality spirit that was being made in some of the larger distilleries. And, you know, a 300-gallon still would go through a ton of soap in the course of a year to keep this frottage down. So Parliament whiskey in its early days wasn't very well regarded by Irish people, and it would have mostly have been for people within the Pale, or within the kind of the eastern seaboard of Ireland. Interestingly, this is where we have the etymology of the word gouger. So if you've ever been gouged in a deal, or you feel that somebody's a bit of a con man, you might call them a gouger. And this word derived from the people who worked for the excise office in Ireland at the time would have to go around and gauge the size of the stills, i.e. measure with tapes the size and the volumes and the capacities of the stills. And they weren't very well respected. So the word gauger got corrupted to gougers, and gougers were notorious for taking bribes and for over-exaggerating the size of the stills, so they weren't very well regarded by the distillers, hence the word gougers, to gouge, to extract money by dishonest means. So going back to our previous slide, we have here what happens during maturation in any spirit when it goes into an oak cask, which is in this case whiskey. You have a char layer on the inside of the barrel here. That char layer will remove some of the harsher congeners, the harsher elements. Then over here, you also have concentration. Liquid gets concentrated because oak barrels are not airtight. There is some evaporation, and that goes up into the rafters. That's what we call the angel share. But what goes in to the spirit is equally as important. Color and flavors, and known as congeners, get extracted from the oak into the spirit. And a lot of the notes that we associate with whiskey today, like vanilla, and that's and some of the coconut notes and some of the spice notes, that's where they come from the cask. And also oxygen gets added in. And as the spirit gets a lot older, this oxygen reacts in a process called oxidation with the spirit, and that can create some very interesting notes where the fruit notes turn into more of these kind of mature, like prune, date, and raisin notes, and that's called oxidization, which results in a flavor characteristic known as rancio, and that denotes very old flavors. But before we go too much further, we have poitín, we have Parliament whiskey, but out of Parliament whiskey, which was not well regarded, grew, thanks to the 1682 malt tax, what we now know as Irish pot still whiskey. I'm going to pour a little bit of this. This is Redbreast 12-year-old, which is distilled in Middleton. Would not have been originally distilled in Middleton, would have originally been distilled in Dublin. But what is pot still whiskey? So I think we're all going to be more or less familiar with the concept of malt whiskey. Malt whiskey is where you take 100% malted barley and you mash it, you create your beer, and it goes through copper pot still a number of times. That distillate then goes into your oak cask for 3 years, and out of there you have got malt whiskey. If that comes from a single distillery, it's single malt whiskey. Similarly, pot still whiskey, and this is a uniquely Irish style, it can be made anywhere else in the world, but it can't really be called pot still whiskey anywhere else in the world for reasons that will come later. Pot still whiskey is exactly the same as malt whiskey with one key difference. It's not 100% malted barley in the mash bill. It's malted barley plus other grains. Now, principal amongst those other grains would have been unmalted barley. You could have had oats at the time, you could have had rye, you could have had wheat, but it would have been a combination mainly of malted plus unmalted barley with other grains. Now, what that does, instead of the very round, rich, buttery, and very cereal-driven character that you can expect from malt whiskey. From pot still whiskey, you get something slightly different. I'm going to give this a little nose. There's quite a lot of fruit character in pot still whiskey. It's a little bit tighter on the nose than you might expect from malt whiskey. And I always get a slightly bramble bush type of blackberry or blackcurrant nose on it as well. I'm going to add a little bit of water. Now, this is a single pot still whiskey that would have been matured in oak casks, including sherry oak casks. So we could expect some of that sherry oak cask influence to be red fruit. And that really, really zings out on the nose when you add a little bit of water. Apple is a note that is consistent through almost every Irish whiskey on the market at the moment. And this is very much ripe red apple. Not golden delicious, that's a green apple. But think of a very ripe red apple skin. That's the type of nose you're getting off of. And there are some spice notes coming through as well. I'll give it a quick taste. And this is where pot still really separates from malt whiskey, because pot still has got a very creamy, oily texture. So I think I inhaled a little bit just there. Bear with me. So with pot still, you're also going to get a slightly spicy kick on the finish, which is the influence of the unmalted barley. A lot of people who drink rye whiskey in America identify with the spiciness on the end of it. But the real driving characteristic of pot still whiskey is the fruit. So pot still whiskey, I just spotted there's a little typo there. So if necessity is the mother of invention, economy is its father. And a lot of times when you look at the history of various different spirits in the world and how they've evolved, they will evolve out of what is the cheapest way to make the product that we want to sell. Now, that's not the most romantic story in the world, and that's why you're not going to see it on a lot of brand literature. But the malt tax of 1682 basically imposed a tax according to how much malted barley you used in the production of your whiskey. And so a fantastic workaround for that was to use a combination of malted and unmalted barley in your whiskey. And hence the birth of pot still Irish whiskey with this combination. So this would have been the type of whiskey that became very prevalent in the larger distillers. Remember, at this time, poitín is still being produced in the more rural parts of Ireland, the southwest, the west, and the northwest, and namely Cork, Kerry, Connemara, and Galway, and up in Donegal and the Inishowen Peninsula in particular. Each would have had their own local style, but Dublin pot still whiskey in particular became very, very, very popular throughout the British Empire. In Dr. Samuel Johnson's famous dictionary of 1755, he described it as particularly distinguished for its pleasant and mild flavour. The Highland sort is somewhat hotter, and by corruption in Scotch they call it whiskey. So at this stage we have the word whiskey very well established in the English language. And when he talks about the Highland sort, he's almost certainly talking about malt whiskey, which would have, for the most part, been double distilled in Scotland, and there would have been the use of some peat, hence giving it that slightly smoky phenolic characters that we identify typically with Islay whiskey these days. But Scotch whiskey, because it had been distilled twice in a pot still rather than 3 times in a pot still, would have had a heavier body, would have had a few more of the congeners coming through from the distillation process, whereas Irish whiskey, which at this stage was beginning to lean towards being triple distilled, which is all down to a Scotsman, which we're going to get onto very soon. But a critical phase in the history of both wine and spirits in Europe and the world was the phylloxera blight. Phylloxera, for those who don't know, is a small louse, a parasite. And this parasite basically was brought to France in the 1840s, I believe, and by the 1860s had infested almost all of the vineyards in France, destroying the wine crop. At the time, brandy was the spirit that was drunk throughout the British Empire. But now brandy was no longer available, so they were looking for an immediate replacement for brandy, and the thing that was available and most palatable to the English palate at the time was not Scotch whiskey, but Irish whiskey. Remember, at this time, Ireland was very much part of the British Empire and the Union. So anybody who's a whiskey historian will know the work of Alfred Bernard, the Whiskey Distilleries of the United Kingdom. In 1887, he described in great detail all the various distilleries around the country, but he paid quite a lot of attention to the 6 distilleries that were operational in Dublin at the time. You can see one of them on the right. This is the John Jameson and Sons Distillery on Bow Street in Dublin. And the distilleries in Dublin by the latter part of the 1800s were enormous enterprises. Dublin was by far the center of distillation in the world at this stage. The success of this pot still style of whiskey that had taken root in the hearts and minds of people throughout the British Empire really blossomed and mushroomed over the course of the 1800s. And a lot of that was down to this gentleman here. A lot of you will recognize the face. That is John Jameson. John Jameson, believe it or not, was a Scotsman. He came to Ireland to start his own distillery. He brought triple distillation, the idea of triple distillation on an industrial scale, to Ireland, largely responsible for that lighter style that we still associate with today. Bottle of Jameson here, one of their small batch releases, which is a little bit older. Now, Redbreast and Jameson have one thing in common, and that is pot still whiskey. Jameson whiskey today is a blend of pot still whiskey and grain whiskey. I'm going to come to grain whiskey in a little while. We are galloping through a history of whiskey here. But John Jameson was a Scotsman. He came to Ireland. He was raised through marriage. The Hague family, famous Sicilian family who had, I believe, Isla and a couple of other spots in Scotland. I'm going to have to ask Dave Brew, who I'm going to be talking to on Saturday, to give me the lowdown on that. Then we have the four big distilleries in Dublin, where John Jameson of Bow Street, John Power of John's Lane, and it's still referred to as Powers of John's Lane. George Rowan Co. of Thomas Street. Now, Rowan Co. was an enormous distillery, probably the largest of all of them, but it fell into decline with great decline of Irish whiskey that happened over the course of the next 100 years. It actually closed, but it has had a rebirth recently. And then William Jameson of Marylebone Lane, and I believe there's another Scottish marriage into a Scottish, which wasn't Hague family, was it'll come to me later on. But basically, there was a large Scottish influence in the distillation here, to the extent that a lot of whiskey that was sold over the course of the 1900s, the 1800s, and certainly the late 1800s, was hybrid whiskey. It would have been a marriage of Scottish and Irish whiskies, and that style has died out, and it's not really legally, technically possible anymore to blend Irish and Scotch and still call it whiskey, for reasons of geographical indication and technical files, which we'll touch on later very briefly. Okay, so we're about halfway through here, and we're at the high point of the history of Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey is outselling every other spirit in the world by orders of magnitude. This new triple distillation style, when combined with the pot still style of Irish whiskey, creates a very clean, smooth, refined, approachable style of whiskey. So there were 88 licensed distilleries at the height of this pot still boom, producing more than 12 million 9-litre cases annually. And Irish whiskey was by far the largest spirits category at the time. So I'm going to enjoy a little bit more of this Redbreast before we discard and move on, because nothing good can last forever. And around the time that Irish whiskey was enjoying its boom period in the 1800s, especially late 1800s, a few threats were happening, and that had a large effect on not just whiskey, but also poitín. So Porter Tobias Matthew started the temperance movement. In fact, about 200 yards from here in Skibbereen, there's a plaque commemorating the first temperance hall, which I believe dates to 1836. And the temperance movement in Ireland was largely supported by the Roman Catholic Church, which was the greatest social influence in Ireland at the time. And it was a move to basically swear off alcohol consumption. It was later took on a different lease of life in America, where it became one of the driving forces behind what was to become the Prohibition movement. In rural Ireland, the Great Famine had a devastating effect, and that lasted for 4 years at its peak, but it had essentially the potato crop suffered a blight, much like the wine crop had suffered a blight, flocks for a blight previously in France. However, the difference between the wine crop in France and the potato crop in Ireland was the potato was the staple diet of the Irish people. For a lot of people, it was the only food they could eat. So the typical poutine making and producing areas of Ireland were absolutely devastated. Millions died, millions more emigrated. Then we're going to fast forward a little bit until World War I. Ireland was still part of the empire. My grandfather fought for the British Army in World War I in Ypres, and it would have been a very normal thing to do at the time. And then in the 20s in Ireland, there was a lot of civil unrest through the late 1800s up the early 20th century. And from 1916 up to 1920, there was a lot of unrest, guerrilla warfare. If you want to look at movies like Michael Collins, it gives you good insight into what was happening in the country at the time. There was a War of Independence, which was largely won, although partitioned the country into the Republic and the 6 counties of Ulster, which remained part of the Union. Followed that immediately, hot on the heels of the Civil War, which basically rent the country in two. And the Civil War was fought largely on the basis of people who accepted that there could be and should be partition. And then followed on directly from that was Prohibition in America. And the Irish routes of export and the routes to market to America were largely cut off. Up to this point in America, Irish whiskey was seen as the leading style of whiskey, and it would have been pot still whiskey. It might have been a little bit of blending going into. We're going to talk about that in a little second. But Locke's whiskey is very interesting. Locke's whiskey was the leading whiskey in the world at the time. It was, it would have outsold what Jim Beam is selling these days. It was, shifting serious units. And in fact, Irish whiskey, by the time Prohibition came around, Irish whiskey was very much leading whiskey in America. In fact, American whiskey spelt with an E because they were imitating Irish whiskey because it's a superior product. And Irish whiskey by this stage was spelt with the E. Over the course of Prohibition, much of bootlegged alcohol that was smuggled in from Canada was Scotch, and much of fake alcohol that was made in nasty stills and coloured was labelled as Irish because these counterfeiters could get more money for a bottle that was labelled as Irish whiskey than they would have gotten for a bottle that was labelled as American whiskey or Scotch whiskey. And over the course of the more or less 10 years of Prohibition, Irish whiskey went from being the thing that everybody wanted to the thing that would kill you. So it was a real nail in the coffin of Irish whiskey at this stage. And then just to finish everything off, the Irish government in the 1930s decided to have a trade war with Britain, their largest export and import partner. The slogan at the time was, I believe, burn everything British except their coal. So there was a lot of rancor there at the time from within the Irish government. But what that then did in terms of the Irish whiskey trade, it meant that you couldn't really export Irish whiskey to anywhere in the empire. So they'd lost their route to market to America. They'd lost their route to market everywhere in the British Empire. So essentially, these calamities sparked the start of the collapse of Irish whiskey. But principal among them, and I think he gets a bad rap for this, was an Irish exciseman turned inventor, turned distiller by the name of Aeneas Coffee. Now, Aeneas Coffee started out, he was a very bright, intelligent polyglot. He was a man of many different skills. He began his life as an excise junior clerk in 1813. By 1816, he was promoted to Inspector General of Excise in Dublin. And that is the mark of an exceptional man. He was shot up through the ranks. Over the course of the 20s, he led a lot of campaigns to basically destroy the poaching industry in Ireland, because that was part of his job as an excise officer. Poaching was illegal, unaged whiskey. Excise and duty was not collected on it because people are just doing it in their backyards or in the hills. Now that's where the word moonshine comes from, another etymology corner moment there. Moonshine, moonshiners would distill their poaching in the hills at night, away from the prying eyes of the local constabulary. But sometimes the excise would gather a ragtag bunch of mercenaries and launch raids on areas. And famously, in the Inishowen Peninsula in Donegal, Aeneas Coffee was part of one of these raids, and he had his skull caved by one of the ranked combatants from the other side, the side of the poaching makers. And these were running battles, were no small thing, and they would happen over the course of years over the Irish countryside. But he recovered from that, thankfully, and he submitted many reports, and it was a large part of the classification of Irish whiskey until he, in the background, while he was doing all of this, he was working on perfecting what we now know as the process of continuous distillation. And continuous distillation is not like pot still distillation. I'm going to ask you to cast your minds back to the slide at the start where you have a long, tall, continuous still, which you can run continuously, hence the name. It had been developed in turns by various French engineers and by, notably by a Scottish engineer by the name of Robert Stein, who was the connection with the William Jameson distillery. It just came back to me. But it was, it's agreed generally that it was perfected by this gentleman, Aeneas Coffee, and he patented his version of the continuous column still in 1830. And without that, we would not have grain whiskey, we would not have what we now know as vodka, and from the derivative, from the new grain spirit that is still there, we wouldn't have gin, we wouldn't have very many different styles of spirits, such as Armagnac, bourbon, most of them use short column stills. Even some of the claret, not clarins, what's the rum I'm thinking of? Agricole rum use column still as well. But column distillation, with column distillation, continuous distillation in a column still, you can make a far more high ABV spirit. And the higher the ABV, the lower the level of congeners or character or flavor profile that you can, that the final spirit is going to have. For instance, if you distill something up to 95% ABV, only really do that in a column still, thanks to the progress that was made in that design by Aeneas Coffee. You are going to have something that is 95% of that bottle is spirit, pure ethanol, and the other 5% will be some water and some flavor congeners that will carry the flavor. But that, you're looking really at a neutral spirit there. So this created a bit of a decision and a quandary for the people working in the Irish whiskey industry, specifically in the Dublin, the four big Dublin distillers that we saw earlier. They were sitting pretty, they were riding high, they had this fantastically premium product called pot still whiskey that they knew how to make, and nobody else really was making anything quite that good anywhere else in the world. And they saw this new, quite pure, light, refined spirit that was made in column stills. They saw that as a threat, because some distillers in Ireland, but many, many more distillers in Scotland, started blending this new grain spirit with either malt whiskey or pot still whiskey, creating a lighter style. And this is essentially the invention of blended whiskey. And what I have in my glass is a blended whiskey. It is Powers Gold Label. Powers and Paddy's would have been the more popular whiskey in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. They weren't really widely available outside of Ireland until more recently, and that's a shame because they're both very fine whiskies. And now there's a lot of different expressions of Powers. This one is gold label. There's also Powers John's Lane, which is 100% pot still. This is a fantastic blend of pot still and grain. So you get the rich fruit notes of the pot still, and you get a little bit of that kind of marzipan character that you can sometimes get in grain whiskies. Again, I'm going to add a little bit of water to it. See, the grain comes out a lot more when you add water to this one. This is very drinkable. The spice and the dryness that you associate with pot still whiskey is definitely there at the end. You get a lovely kind of harmonious marriage of fruit and spice and vanilla. It's a very good all-rounder, Powers. So blended whiskey is born thanks to the birth of grain whiskey. Now, the Irish distillers, the Dublin distillers in particular, weren't fans, and they called it snidely, they called it silent spirit, because it didn't have any character. It had nothing to say for itself. It was silent. And they refused to acknowledge it as a legitimate recipe or a legitimate ingredient in the creation of whiskey. They said that whiskey is whiskey, it's made in pot stills, that's the way it's been done for hundreds of years. If you use this newfangled invention, that's a silent spirit, that is not whiskey. And there was lots of legal wrangles over this, and there was lots of representations from the blenders. At this stage, you had very excellent blenders in Scotland, like the Chivas brothers and Johnny Walker, and they were using malt whiskies from various different malt distilleries and blending them on a bed of grain whiskey and exporting that very, very, very successfully. And again, the conservative Dublin distillers saw this as quite a threat. So they campaigned, they released a book called The Truths About Whiskey. And it was basically quite a long polemic decrying the use of silent spirit, as they called it at the time. Eventually, they lost. They lost the right to only call pot distilled spirit whiskey, and now column distilled spirit could also be called whiskey, especially if it was blended with pot distilled spirit. So now you have a perfect storm. You have the temperance movement. You have the after effects of the Great Famine. You've got World War I, followed hot on the heels of World War I. You've got independence, the War of Independence, the Civil War. You got Prohibition, and then you got the Trade War with Britain. Over the course of this period of roughly 50 years, Irish whiskey went from the best regarded spirit in the world and the most popular and most and produced the most volume spirit in the world. That's a term, I'm going to go with that. Most produced spirit in the world, to a state of decrepitude, if we're honest. Sharp, sharp decline. So by the time the 50s had come around, Irish whiskey was really in quite a poor place in terms of its economic health. Now, this still that you see here on the right-hand side is actually the original 130,000 gallon still that was used in the Middleton Distillery. The Middleton Distillery was part of Cork Distillers, and eventually, I'm going to actually, we'll talk about it in a little second. I want to talk about what happened to Irish whiskey in after this trade delegation. Essentially, a series of trade delegations in the late 50s and early 60s from Irish whiskey makers to the US, because the US is by far, as it remains, by far the largest whiskey market in the world. And these Irish distillers were trying to figure out, how can we get the US to like us again? What can we do to appeal to the US whiskey drinker? And they discovered that the US whiskey drinker was something light and easy drinking. And guess what? When you mix pot still whiskey with grain whiskey, you get something light with good character, but it's easy drinking. Now, the large industrial distillers of Ireland had long ago eschewed the use of peat as a means of drying their malted barley. So what you have is this classic style of fruity, light, slightly spicy pot still, but made even lighter and more palatable by the addition into the blend of young column distilled grain spirit. So that is the birth, really, of what we call the three classic Irish blends. One of them, obviously, would be Jameson. So, Jim, I'm going to pour this again because actually might drop. Sorry, I had cars before, so a little wash. Terrible waste of there. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do because we're at 50 minutes and we're almost there, almost at the end of the journey. At the end of this, if you want to hang around and tell me what you've been drinking and share that with the group, that would be amazing. So Jameson, as I described before, is a blend of pot still whiskey and grain whiskey. The other main whiskey in Ireland at the time would have been Bushmills. Now, Bushmills is a malt distillery up in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. Bushmills that emerged was a blend of malt whiskey with grain whiskey. And then sitting in the middle between the two of them, you had Tullamore, or it was known as Tullamore too. Tullamore whiskey would have been malt whiskey and pot still whiskey blended with grain whiskey. So these were the three staples of the great Irish whiskey blends. And around this time, you saw the birth of Duty Free Airport in Shannon, birth of Irish coffee. We're going to talk about that at a later stage because I do want to get onto some more pertinent stuff to Irish whiskey. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you have a Robin Redbreast. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you got people cheersing whiskey. Some of them neat, some of them mixed. Doesn't look terribly well. I'm guessing that's going to be with ginger and ice or with soda and ice. So that's basically how Irish whiskey was now looked at. It was a nice, easy drinker. The success of this ingress into the American market, repositioning Irish whiskey as a smooth, easy drinking, approachable blend, meant that it was now a drink for a social moment. But during this time, everything had to consolidate because it wasn't economical to run these distilleries anymore. So most of the distilleries in Ireland closed over the course of the 20th century. They were all amalgamated into one company called Irish Distillers Limited. And the last outlier to join Irish Distillers was Bushmills in 1972. By 1970s, the Powers Distillery, Paddy, Roe & Co. had all been amalgamated, and they were all based in one new distillery down in Middleton in County Cork. So by 1980, you've only two operational whiskey distilleries in Ireland. You've got Bushmills in the north and the new Middleton distillery, which replaced the old Middleton distillery, and that transition happened in July 1975. One night, the old Middleton distillery stopped producing. The next morning, the new Middleton distillery started producing. And the Middleton distillery that opened in 1975, the new distillery, was by far the most technologically advanced distillery anywhere in the world at the time. It could create every sort of grade and weight and style of pot still whiskey you care to make. It could also, if it cared to, do the same for malt whiskey and also do the same for grain whiskey. And it needed to because this new distillery created all the liquid that would go into Powers, into Paddy's, into Redbreast, into Green Spot, into Jameson, two of the component liquids that would go into Tullamore, one of the component liquids that would go into the Bushmills blend. So what happened? Why is everyone talking about Irish whiskey today? Well, Irish whiskey is definitely in the midst of an enormous renaissance. And if you had to pin it on one or two people, the first name that would come to mind is John Teeling. Dr. John Teeling was not a distiller, he's a businessman, but he spotted an opportunity when an old biofuel refinery plant was being mothballed and sold off. Essentially, he realized that if he bought it, a biofuel refinery is essentially the same mechanism as a whiskey distillery. If you think about it, whiskey distillation, you're refining biofuel. You're refining a fermented version of organic matter. So he bought a refinery in Cooley and converted it into a distillery, and he started Cooley and Kilbeggan Company, and he revived Locks whiskey. He created Connemara, peated Irish whiskey. He stuck with double distillation rather than triple distillation, which was the typical style of all other distilleries in Ireland by this point. Beautiful image on the right. It's this very most romantic area of the west of Ireland in County Galway known as Connemara. He created Connemara whiskey, which is a peated double distilled whiskey, an Irish whiskey made very much in the Scottish style. And Tyrconnell and Locks was reborn, which had once been the most popular whiskey in the world. So Dr. John Teeling now had the only independent whiskey distillery in Ireland. And they were doing their own thing, ploughing their own furrow. The other thing that was interesting and key to what is now happening in Irish whiskey is Pernod Ricard bought Irish Distillers Limited, and then it had to be separated, so Bushmills could no longer be part of it. That was sold to Diageo. But in the new Middleton distillery, Pernod Ricard preserved the tradition of pot still Irish whiskey. It was the only place in the world that Irish pot still whiskey was made, and up to very recently, that was true. It was the only source of Irish pot still. That's no longer true, but it certainly preserved the pot still style, because pot still was, of course, needed for Jameson. But then brands of Redbreast and Green Spot, which are cornerstones of pot still Irish whiskey today, they all survived and thrived because of what happened in the Middleton distillery under the auspices of the Irish Distillers Limited and Pernod Ricard. Then we have the second wave of micro distilleries, the wave that came after the Cooley and Kilbeggan wave. Places like Dingle, West Cork, where I'm talking to you from now, Ecklandville up in Northern Ireland, where they're doing some really interesting things with mash bills. Teeling Distillery. Now, Teeling is not Dr. John Teeling, it is his sons. They took quite a lot of the aged stock that was left to them as part of the sale of Cooley and Kilbeggan when it was sold to Beam Suntory. And with that aged stock, they came out with their own brand called Teeling Whiskey. They then opened the first new whiskey distillery in Dublin. All the whiskey distilleries in Dublin had been closed, and they started distilling whiskey for the first time in Dublin for many decades. And we have the Royal Oak Distillery, which is what you'd associate with brands like the Irishman. And they're all making mostly malt whiskey. Not a lot of them making grain whiskey, because that's quite an industrial process, but some of them start making pot still whiskey now. The Jameson, it's difficult to describe Jameson because there's so many different expressions. I mean, you can get some excellent, like Jameson 18, wonderful, wonderful whiskey. It's an outstanding whiskey by anybody's measure. Standard Jameson is very good drinking whiskey and mixing whiskey. We're going to get onto that in a second. We're at 58 minutes, but I'm going to power through and get you there close enough to the hour. So the major acquisitions and investments then happened around 10 to 15 years ago. William Grant and Sons, one of the finest traditional whiskey makers in Scotland, still a family-owned company, they acquired Tullamore brand, and they built a new distillery in Tullamore. It's quite an enormous distillery. I was working for Tullamore on a consultancy basis on many projects at the time, and their commitment, a financial commitment to new wave of Irish distilling, considering that it's just money from a family company, is really something to behold. Cooley Kilbeggan was then sold by John Teeling to Beam Suntory. And then Bushmills, which was owned by Diageo, was sold by Diageo to the Beckman family, who own Jose Cuervo Tequila. And hot on the heels of selling the Bushmills distillery, Diageo then made a huge investment and built the Roe and Company, or Roe and Co. distillery, next to the Guinness, part of the Guinness brewery grounds. If anybody knows anything about beer, they know that Guinness is owned by Diageo. Guinness is one of the original companies that formed Diageo a few decades ago. And so Roe & Co. now has a new life. One of the original four Dublin distilleries, and now has a new life as part of the Diageo family. And then we have the new third wave of independent distilleries. Blackwater Distillery, who are doing really fascinating out there stuff. Ecklandville, I mentioned before, Killowen, they're doing poachine, and they're doing some really interesting finishes. Shed Distillery, which is making pot still whiskey, is also famous for their gin. Their gunpowder Irish gin comes in a very identifiable blue bottle. Bowen Distillery, Dublin Liberties Distillery, got some lovely liquid. Waterford Distillery, Mark Rainier, who was behind the relaunch of the Bruichladdich Distillery in Islay, has invested very, very heavily into the new Waterford Distillery, and they are committed very heavily to the idea of terroir. That they are committed to the idea that you can tell one field from another field in a whiskey. We'll get onto that in a second. It's a very interesting proposition. And finally, the Great Northern Distillery. We come full circle. John Teeling, when he converted the biofuel refinery to the Cooley distillery, repeated a trick. He then bought the Harp Brewery in Dundalk, which was the home of Harp Lager, and he converted it into a distillery. And now that's the Great Northern Distillery. The Great Northern Distillery will not be known in future really primarily as a source of its own brand of whiskey, but it is the greatest producer in Ireland right now of contract distilling. Because all of the majors have their own whiskey that they're making for themselves, all of these minor small distilleries, they need sources of grain whiskey. They at the Great Northern Distillery, they can make pot still whiskey to a recipe, they can make malt whiskey to a recipe. So it's not a million miles away from what the new Middleton Distillery did, the Irish whiskey industry back in the 70s. So where is Irish whiskey now? We come from a place where in 1980 there were 2 active whiskey distilleries in the country. Now, as of December 2019, there were 31 active whiskey distilleries. I'm reliably informed that now, 5 months later, that has jumped by 3. So there are now 34 active whiskey distilleries in Ireland. Irish whiskey is going through an enormous boom. Out of those 34 active whiskey distilleries in the island of Ireland, and it's important when we talk about Irish whiskey, we talk about the whole country. For the purposes of Irish whiskey, we don't see a border as being the key differentiating factor. We see the fact that it's all made on the one island is very much part of the technical file and the geographical indication of Irish whiskey. Out of those 34 active distilleries in Ireland, 22 of them are producing Irish pot still whiskey. And I think that is very interesting. It gives you an idea of where the future of the Irish whiskey category is going. Photograph to your right, I took on my phone at the new extension of West Cork Distillers yesterday. So that is the freshest image you're going to get of an Irish whiskey distillery. There are also 2 small grappa stills that they have, that they bought for a couple of grand, that they have ferreted away to play with. But there you see 3 large copper pot stills and 2 column stills, which are broken into the analyzer and the rectifier. If anybody has done their WSET level 2, they'll know why column still, in order to not have it go 15 meters into the air, you can essentially break it into 2 sections. And so what is happening in Irish whiskey at the moment? Well, you have a lot of people who've really got on board with the idea of Irish whiskey. Largely that is down to the cocktail movement, and a large part of that would be down to the 2 boys, Jack and Sean, who are behind the Dead Rabbit bar in New York, soon to become Dead Rabbits throughout the USA. They were for a long time the leading cocktail bar in the world, and they pioneered and championed the use of Irish whiskey in cocktails. Their book, From Barley to Blarney, where they travel around the country in the company of Tim Earlehy from Tullamore Dew and Rebecca Dooley, is very, very worth reading. I highly commend it to any of you. So we have a great pot still revival happening now. Mash bills. So what are the differences in styles? Well, one of the great differences in style is what grains you use. Now, we know in pot still, you can use malted and unmalted barley and some other grains. Now, according to the current definition in the technical file held within the European Union, you can only use 5% of other grains. That's a source of some debate and controversy at the moment, because some distillers like Ecklinville and Blackwater have discovered historical mash bills where you had up to 20-25% oats in the mash bills. So they're making their own spirit along the lines of that historical mash bills, and oats give you a very smooth, very creamy mouthfeel. Then you have yeast strains. I'm going to divest myself of that little bit of Jameson. Unfortunately, I'm throwing away a lot of whiskey during this, but needs must. So when I popped down to the West Cork Distillers, it's only 10 minutes walk that way. John O'Connell, who's the head of honcho there, very kindly gave me a few samples. Most interesting of which is this. This isn't whiskey, because it's new make spirit. At 62%, that means it's basically come out of the cask at that strength. It's not old enough to be called whiskey. It hasn't been in cask for 3 years. This is around about 2 years old, hence it's very light in color. Oh, he's just made a note there, handwritten on the top, that says yeast. Now, a lot of distillers like Alex Chasko and Teeling, and I know they're experimenting with this up in Killowen as well, are exploring the idea of wild yeast and what that does. If you use, most whiskey made in Ireland and the UK uses one of 3 strains of yeast. I think the name of the most common strain is IDC, which is an independent distillers company, I believe. It's strain M, strain X. I'm not a distiller, so please somebody correct me on that if you know better. But that strain of yeast is very good at producing certain esters. We talked about them before in the orchard fruit esters. It's very good at converting the sugars into alcohol, which is very important for the creation of whiskey eventually. But wild yeast strains will give something different. Now, this yeast is actually, it's a culture of a wild yeast that was harvested from the skins of wild blackberries in a very beautiful spot on the Cork and Kerry border called Gugan Barra. And if you ever happen to be around that way, I highly recommend it. It's the most scenic spots in Ireland to visit. So on the nose, it's a lot more funky than what you would expect from a typical Irish whiskey. It's still triple distilled, but the esters that are coming through, there's a lot more barnyard in here. You're certainly getting the fatter style of porridgey edge of your cereal notes. And because it's 62 or 63, 60, yeah, 62, I'm definitely going to add a substantial amount of water to this before I taste it. In the WSET systematic approach, we always recommend adding a little bit of water when you're tasting, because if you're going through quite a lot of spirits in a day, your ability to taste precisely is quite diminished afterwards. It's very toasty, almost like toasted barley, and very farmyardy. You think of kind of hay and silage. It's that sort of something. Very, very interesting. Very different from what you'd expect from an Irish whiskey distillate. So other types of innovations that are happening at the moment. Cask types. Irish whiskey is less limited than Scotch whiskey in that we do not only have to use oak casks in maturation in Ireland. We can use chestnut as Method and Madness, which is the experimental micro distillery branched off the Middleton distillery has tried recently. You can use any type of oak. There's a brand called JJ Corrie, and they have recently released an Irish whiskey that has been finished in tequila and mezcal casks. In fact, the Scottish Whisky Association, recently relaxed the laws about what casks Scotch producers could use, because Irish whiskey producers were gaining a bit of a head start in them in terms of experimentation around finishing. There's a lot of experimental treatments being used, and I know of a cask that is smoked with seaweed, produces a certain effect. That is again in West Cork, and it's also being used for a whiskey called Curragh, which is part of the Calac vodka, which is a single malt vodka family of brands. Both very, very interesting liquids. And Waterford and the terroir experiment. Time will tell. Can terroir and individual field identification survive the process of barrel aging? Mark Rainier has bet the bank that it does. There's a lot of skepticism out there. Time will tell. That's something definitely worth keeping an eye on. So their first release is due out around now, actually. They were going to have a big party, but unfortunately during the current circumstances, that's not possible. And lastly, but no means leastly, we now have the rebirth of Poitín in Ireland, running at 1 hour and 10, so hopefully most of you are still with me. So Poitín now is being relaunched as a premium brand, a premium category. You have brands like Bon Poitín, launched by Dave Mulligan, who also has bar 1661 in Dublin, which is the world's first and leading Poitín bar. And that is on the menu in places like the American Bar in the Savoy in London, world's leading bar. We also have very interesting Poitíns from the west of Ireland under the brand name of McKeel. There's a specific release that they have which harks back to the tradition of infusing Rishka Baja with herbs and local spices. That's very worth checking out. And there's Mad March here. There's a number of very good poachings on the market available to everybody. And so that is the end of the presentation. I'm aware that I've kept you a little bit, but thanks for sticking with me. I'm going to stop sharing now, but I'm just going to raise a glass and say sláinte. Thank you for your time, and hopefully you've all picked up a little bit more about Irish whiskey over the course of the last 70 minutes. Cheers.
Thanks.
Charlie.
Thank you. Now all I have to do is figure out how to stop sharing.
No one's complaining all the time anyway, so relax. You're all good.
Wow. I did that at a breakneck speed. There was an awful lot of material to get through. Hopefully most people were able to keep up with me and maybe to follow my accent as well, I think. My accent definitely got a lot stronger since I've come back to West Cork for the last couple.
Very clear. Does anyone have any questions they want to put to Charlie while we're still here? You can unmute yourself if you would like to do so. A couple of people have been asking for the PowerPoints. If you're happy to share those, Charlie, I can send those out.
100%, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Charlie, Brian here.
Hey, Brian.
Thanks very much for a very informative hour. I know you galloped through a lot of that very fast, but it was great to get all that detail. Would you like to talk a little bit more about the position that IDL have in the market and how they are influencing the progress of Irish whiskey, particularly in terms of what Irish pot still whiskey means?
Yeah. Okay, that's a very interesting question. It is a hot topic at the moment. First thing I would say is that IDL Irish Distillers has the amount of investment that has gone into Irish distillers from Pernod, especially in establishing Jameson as such a runaway success in the US market and in other areas, means that I do not have a bad word to say about Irish distillers. I'm going to put the opposite position to people. Pot still whiskey, as we know, is something that is made from a mash bill of malted barley and other grains. When the technical file was lodged with the European Union, when the geographical indication was created, I can't remember the year exactly, but we're a couple of decades back at least. Irish distillers were the only people making pot still whiskey, and nobody else was submitting any contrary position to what the definition of pot still whiskey could be. So the definition of pot still whiskey that was lodged at the time was the type of whiskey that Irish distillers were making. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So Irish distillers were making a type of whiskey that was malted barley and unmalted barley with up to 5% other grains in the mash bill. And that was what it was. That's what they were doing. That's what they were making. There weren't any objections to it at the time. And that is the legal definition of Irish pot still whiskey now under law. Speaking of which, I'm going to go back to one of my favorites and put a little red crest in my glass while we're having a conversation, which is obviously made in Middleton by Irish distillers to this specification. Now, with the emergence of new distilleries, places like Dingle, Teeling, most of the micro distilleries and boutique distilleries that have opened in Ireland over the last 10 years are making pot still whiskey. And one of those distilleries, and I know he won't have any problem with me using his name in connection to this, is run by a gentleman called Peter Mulryan, who literally wrote the book on Irish whiskey. There's a book called Irish Whiskey by Peter Mulryan. It is the textbook on Irish whiskey. If you go to YouTube and you look, you search Irish pot still whiskey, there is a video by Irish distillers, IDL, featuring Peter Mulryan talking through what Irish pot still whiskey is. Peter has subsequently unearthed some old recipes from various distilleries around Ireland that might not necessarily have been the Dublin distilleries, but some of the regional distilleries that were making pot still whiskey with a far higher proportion of oats in particular, and other grains. Now, the word that people use, and it's important to remove ourselves from this, whenever we're talking about whiskey in a historical sense, people will use the word corn. In a historical sense, corn does not refer to maize or sweet corn. Corn refers to any cereal grain. So some of these old recipes will refer to corn of which malted barley X%, unmalted barley X%, oats X%, rye Y%. And Peter's position, along with some of the other newer distilleries, are like Ecklinville is making a whiskey at the moment that is maturing. It has made the whiskey, it is maturing, it's older than 3 years, where they are reproducing a mash bill from the old Comber distillery, which would have been local to where they are, near in the Ards Peninsula, County Down. And Ecklinville makes some of the best whiskey in Ireland. And it's not a quality, it's not a conversation about quality, it's a conversation kind of about authenticity to a way. Irish distillers back in the day when the technical file was launched defined what pot still whiskey was and therefore could be. There are now legitimate voices saying that, well, we now understand that pot still whiskey historically could have been fallen well outside of your definition of pot still whiskey. And so the conversation is very active within the industry about, is there going to be a new definition of pot still whiskey? Or is there going to be a separate category created, perhaps called historical pot still whiskey or heritage pot still whiskey, which would preserve the current definition of pot still whiskey and create a separate category wherein distillers can sell a product that would be made according to historical mash bills. So hopefully that's not too controversial or too long-winded a position for that, but I think that's a pretty accurate reflection of where it is at. The last I heard, which was about 6 months ago, those conversations are still very active at a high level. And I don't have any update on what the new position is on that at the moment. Although I fully expect there will be some sort of movement in the year.
That's great, Charlie. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.